Yeah, good. All right. There we go. That transition from drumming to preaching is a challenge once in a while. You should try it sometime. Any drummers? I got a job for you. All right. Well, we are in a series called Exiled, Living for God in a Pagan Culture. And as we've gone through this series, one of the things that we have been tracking along is the exile that happened in Israel late in their kingship. So Israel was God's nation, God's chosen land, God's promised land to the Israelite people. And it became a nation. They wanted kings. And I'm giving you a very, very quick overview so we could get right into the topic, okay? And it broke into two kingdoms. The northern part was called Israel, and the southern part was called Judah. And the northern part was destroyed and dismantled, leaving only Judah as God's people in that region. And God had told a couple of prophets, but specifically what we had looked at was Habakkuk, about his coming judgment on Judah. And he said, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians as my tool of judgment on these people to bring justice to my land. So God raised up the Babylonians. They came in and they conquered Judah. They were a violent group of people, and they conquered them, and they took all of the people and transported them, made them walk all the way to Babylon. And when in Babylon, their plan was to basically infiltrate them, to cause them to turn Babylonian, to learn the Babylonian language, to be educated by Babylonians, to learn about the Babylonian gods, and eventually, after a couple of generations, just to be Babylonian. And this was what the nation of Israel, Judah specifically, was having to go through. And in this series, we've looked through the lives of Jeremiah, of Daniel, and we're looking today at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we've looked at our own condition as a nation. And I don't often preach big scope kind of things. I really try to make things practical. But have there been some practical points that we've talked about over the last few weeks? Yeah, it's kind of stomped on my toes a little bit. And if you're limping coming in, I see it's done the same to you. So, but that being said, as we look at ourselves as the church, one of the things that we have to recognize is we are a light in a dark world. And in the United States of America, we've had this advantage or this blessing of God to be in what we call a Christian nation, founded on Christian principles. But as you know, darkness doesn't stay dormant. Darkness will grow in our world if left unchecked and if the light does not continue to shine. And what we found is in our world, we went from having home field advantage in the United States to now we're kind of like visitors on the opponent's turf. And things are not just given to the church. Oh, the church is a good thing. The church gets a free pass because it's the church. The church is challenged or completely disregarded in our culture. And as we look at this, in a way, we are living in a similar way that the Judites, is that what they would be called, were in Babylon as we are today. And it's not a perfect apples to apples comparison, but there are some principles that I wanted to pull from the exile, that time of exile, to where we are today. And there were three principles that we wanted to talk through. I'm taking 1 week for each principle. The first was we have to resolve to have hope. We have to resolve to have hope. We know God is in control. And we know God wins at the end of the book. So we don't get too caught up in all of the stuff that's happening in the world right now, because when we look at the finish line, He wins. And whether that's uncomfortable for us or whether we understand our junk or not that we're going through, He wins at the end. So much like watching a movie that you've already seen and you know how it ends, there's no reason for suspense in it. You're like, okay, it's all right because God wins. He's in control. Last week, anybody remember what we preached last week? Yeah, something. We have to have a mission. We have a job to do while we are here. And we looked at Daniel, and he had Nebuchadnezzar, and he lived in such a way that he honored and respected this evil king. And he lived in a way that he wanted Nebuchadnezzar to succeed. Even though he didn't agree with him, even though Nebuchadnezzar was not following God, did not recognize God, he lived in a way that was honoring and glorifying God, but also respectful and it earned him the ability to speak and have his voice heard. And we looked at the way we live. Do we live in such a way that is so respectful to our opponents that we have earned a voice to be heard in this world? And if not, we need to change. Because the world is not going to change to accommodate us. We have to change who we are and have a heart like what God has called us to have in order to engage a lost and dying world and for them to hear his voice. So this week, we're getting to the last point. Where do we draw the line? Okay, and I know that this has kind of been leading up to this, and this has been the question that many of us have had. Where do we draw the line? And one of the things that I want to highlight is a little bit last week, we're on a mission. And as Christians, we recognize the Great Commission says, therefore, go and make disciples. What is that word there? Go. Are we supposed to sit here and invite people in and make disciples as they come in? Or are we supposed to go? Go. Another verse that we love to use here is in Matthew 16. And Jesus is talking to Peter. He says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And when we look at this, we look at the gates of Hades. And I think sometimes our mentality is we hunker down in the church, and the gates of Hades attack us and attack us and attack us. But if we just stay together and we stay our nice little unit here, then the gates of Hades won't overcome us. And that's not what that verse says at all. Who's ever been attacked by a gate? There's going to be somebody, but the whole point is that gates are not offensive weapons, they are defensive tools. And as we go into the world, we go into a lost and dying and hurting and sinful and broken world with the hope of Jesus Christ and the love of Jesus Christ and the message of the gospel. We go, and will we be defeated when we go? No, because we are storming the gates of hell every time we leave this room. This is not church. That is. This is where you get equipped. But when we become the church, that is when we actually recognize that we go. You got that? So that is our mission. So if we are to be these followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus, living and striving to grow in maturity and in righteousness and holiness, we step out into the world and it's broken and it's sinful. And here's our dilemma. How do holy, righteous people that are trying to become holy and righteous step out into a sinful world and not get messy? Right? I mean, it's like, I remember when I was a kid, you'd always dress up with your churchy clothes, right? Your church clothes and your suit jacket. And I was such a good-looking little kid, I'll tell you. And I'd be like all spiffed up, ready to go. And then to go to the dump and start looking and playing in the dump, you know you're going to get your church clothes dirty. And I think that's our mentality sometimes as Christians. I'm striving for holiness. I've got Christian friends. That's the only friends I need. They're going to help me grow in maturity. But the reality is you will never grow in maturity until you start to get dirty. Until you start to live out the mission that he has given us. So when we step out into the world, we have to have some standards. Some ways that we recognize, that we resolve beforehand, I am going to draw my line. And this is the line I will draw. These are the things that when they happen around me, I say, I'm going to give grace. But when that line is crossed, I will stand now for what is true. Now, we've been in a place as a country that these have been questions that all of us have been wrestling with. Have you? Absolutely. Where do I draw the line? How far can a government push me? At what point do I get to rebel? And different questions like that. And those are things that are running through all of our minds. Now, I want to tell you, I want to give you the disclaimer. There is absolutely no way, unless we preach for a really, really, really long time, that I'm going to cover every scenario, right? That I'm going to cover every situation, every possible sin, every possible decision the government makes, and every possible solution and answer for the church. Do you understand that this is impossible to do? But what I want to do is have a standard by which we make those decisions. So what we're going to talk about today is a guy named Mishael. And his name is probably not real familiar to you, but you probably know him as Meshach. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, as I was going through this, I picked him on purpose, and you'll see why here in a minute. But I've never heard of a sermon preached on Meshach or Mishael. Have you? This is truly original, and if I mess it up, and that's probably a reason it's never been preached before. But I want to read to you real briefly about who he is or was. It says, among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, he gave the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to his Azariah, Abednego. Now, I was just thinking about this, and there's certainly not an answer to this. Why would we call Daniel his Hebrew name, Daniel, and not call him Belteshazzar, but the other three guys, we call them by their given names and not their Hebrew names? You see how that's kind of backwards? So that's why I'm saying we're preaching about Mishael today. Okay? So I hope that makes sense, and I hope you don't think it's too weird. I want to tell you about Mishael. It says he was from Judah. That means that he grew up in a God-honoring family. With a name like Mishael, what I want you to know, what that name means is who is like God is. I want to say that again. Who is like God is? His name is actually a question. And it is a powerful question, because when you think about this, I want you to think about whatever situation you're going through in your mind. And you ask the question, I am in a really hard circumstance, but who is what God is? It's a statement to God's power, His glory, His wisdom, His ability to see us through different situations. And I imagine when Mishael was a child, his parents said, we are going to give him this name. It's not a name that's a specific name, but it's a name that will apply to all situations of his life. And they raised him to know God. And what we see in Daniel chapter 1 is he was a good-looking guy. You know, I think we often talk about you have to be humble. But in Daniel chapter 1, it says these were good-looking guys, and they were strong and fit and wise beyond their years, and they showed wisdom above all other people. And I think that's an amazing thing, because he stood out. He was intelligent. He was bright. He was educated. And he knew God, and he knew what God was about. He had wisdom inside of him. I imagine the book of Proverbs was read to him. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Knowing God is understanding the world around you. And when your name is who is what God is, your whole life is set up with the framework of saying, and who is God in this situation? Who is what God is? He left his homeland when Babylon wiped it out. He probably had family members and friends that were killed. And he had to travel by foot hundreds of miles to go to Babylon, a place that was not his home. And his friends and family members that were left are weeping and mourning the loss of the people, mourning the loss of the promised land that God had given them, recognizing the sin that had got them to this place. And he showed up. And they recognize you're above all the other guys. You're smarter than them. We want to train you special. We're going to put you in this class with a few other boys here from Judah. And we're going to put you in here, but you are going to become a eunuch. And if you know what that means, you know what happened to him. And this is what happened to him. And as humiliating as it would be to have your nation wiped out, as mournful as it would be to see your friends and family members killed, and now to be humiliated in this way. The grief and the anger that he had to overcome. But he had to recognize that in all of these circumstances, who is what God is? He's above this. He's in control. There was probably some hard times where he was wrestling with that. But who is what God is? And then one of the first days in his class, they must have said, Mishael, what does your name mean? And he said, my name means who is what God is. And I imagine the Babylonians laughed at him. Who is what God is? Let me tell you who your God is. Your God is defeated. We conquered him. The Babylonian gods overpowered the gods of Israel. We are stronger than you, so we're going to give you a new name, a real powerful name. We're going to name you Meshach. Do you know what the name Meshach means? Who is what Aku is? A Babylonian god. Who is what God is? No, your God isn't powerful. We're going to mock you. We're going to mock your God and give you a Babylonian name. Who is what Aku is? And Meshach didn't complain about that. He says, you could call me what you want, but it doesn't change that I know who God is. They taught him. He said, you could call me what you want. You can teach me what you want. They trained him in the ways of the Babylonian Empire. He was an actual ruler in the Babylonian Empire. We're going to read about that in a little bit, that he was over a province. He was considered a wise man. He was trained and educated and flourished. Grades were higher than everybody else. Grades in what? The way the Babylonians are, the Babylonian thought process, the Babylonian God system. He was trained in all of this. Can we learn things and still have a heart that follows God? Can we learn things that don't seem right? Yes, because it didn't change where his heart was. He says, you can call me what you want. You can teach me what you want. I'm not going to honor those gods, but you can teach me all about the enemy. I'll learn all about the enemy and still worship the one and only true God. And Mishael didn't fight losing battles. There's a lesson, what you're going to see in his life that I'll tell you, I think I'm struggling and still struggle to learn, is his righteousness was his own. He recognized that he was a follower of God, the one true God, who is what God is. And when the people around him were sinful, worshiping demonic idols, trying to teach him and influence him in ways that were not of God, he saw this. He did not participate of his own, but he also didn't try and impose his righteousness upon them and say, you need to start acting better. You need to start acting more like what I would be comfortable with. He didn't start to change his environment and try to make everybody appease him for his comfort zone. You know, I think sometimes we as Christians look at this sinful world around us and say, you guys need to be less sinful. We see somebody we work with and they might have a filthy mouth, or they might be sleeping with, somebody that isn't their wife, and you see all of this stuff. And we're like, man, you got to stop all this sinning. I want to tell you, the problem is not their filthy mouth. The problem is not their sexual whatever. Their problem is not their whatever issues and whatever sin it is. The problem is they don't know God. The consequence of that problem is sin. And you can try and get them to stop all the fruit of this evil sin and pick all the fruit off that tree. Say, I don't want to see any fruit of this sinful tree. But you know what a sinful tree will produce? More sinful fruit. And if we're stomping around trying to make everybody else righteous by what our standard of righteousness is, what do they think and believe about God? It's all about what you do and not what your heart is. He didn't condemn the world around him. He lived in such a way that his righteousness was his own. He lived in a righteous way. But he did not impose it upon other people. And when I look at the New Testament, I want you to listen to the tone of what Jesus says in John chapter 3. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. And in John 3:17, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Now, in no way, shape, or form am I saying that sin is okay. What I am saying is that sin in sinners is not the issue. It is a life that is lived apart from God is the issue. And when they put their faith in Jesus Christ in our world today, the fruit of that begins to bear righteousness and love and joy and peace and patience and all of these good things. And the bad fruits start to be replaced by the fruit that God develops within them. So we can't go around becoming condemning kind of people to sinners around us, because you know what sinners do? Sin. And if you're surprised by that, well then surprise. Right? This is what people do that don't know Christ. And when we try and impose our righteousness, we come across as legalistic Pharisees, and nobody wants to be around that. But if we love sinners with the love of God, they get introduced to God, and what happens within them? The sin starts to take care of itself. Let's not be God. Let's be what God asked us to be. Loving people in a broken world. All right, sidetrack. Back to Meshach. Or Mishael, I'm sorry. I don't want to call him Meshach. I don't understand why. He didn't care what they called him. He didn't care what they taught him. He didn't care what they did around him. He was responsible for himself. And I want to talk about how he drew the lines around him. So we're going to actually read all the way through Daniel, or a lot of the way through Daniel chapter 3, and there's just a couple of points that I want to draw out from this passage. So to set the story up, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide and set it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, blah, 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 blah. Okay, do I have to read through all those every time? Okay. All those guys assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up before him. So he builds this idol of himself, this big gold, saying, this is a picture of me. Is there a more arrogant thing? Well, the more arrogant thing is in verse 4. Okay. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every nation, in every language, this is what you are commanded to do. Here's what you're commanded. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship at the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, the nations and people of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, Mishael, as a Jewish boy that grew up in a Jewish culture, would he have a problem with this? Yeah. He knew the law of Moses. He knew in Exodus chapter 20, it said, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow before them or worship them. For I, the Lord, am a jealous, your God, am a jealous God. He says, you shall not worship any other form, any other idol, any other God other than me. I am a jealous God. This is what he had learned from childhood. And when Nebuchadnezzar says, you must bow down and worship this idol, he had a problem. He had a dilemma. Who is got the attorney mindset that's like, well, if you actually just bow down and worshiped God, coincidentally at the same time, maybe you could get away with it, or you're thinking through. And I'm sure these were some of the struggles that he might have had. How can I fit in? When everybody else is bowing down, it's hard for you to be the one that stands up. It's hard when there's consequences for the actions that you have. It's hard when you're going to die if you don't bow down to stand up for what's right. But when it came to an issue that God had clearly spoken about, had God clearly said to not bow down to any other image, he did. This is an issue of black and white. Thou shalt not. So when it came to that issue, he did not. Now he recognized not oftentimes that the king's commands come in conflict with God's law. There are a lot of times that the king's commands, they are really uncomfortable for someone that's following God's law. Would you understand that? But there is not a Bible verse that says, thou shalt not. So you're like, but I'm really uncomfortable. And we struggle with those things. But this was not one of those cases. This was a case where God said, thou shalt not. And the king says, you must. So ultimately, Mishael is in this spot and he says, what will I do? Do you think he came to this conclusion just off the cuff and said, okay, I'm going to stand? Or did he resolve to know where his lines are beyond this? He had a resolution. And when the King Nebuchadnezzar worship team started playing, he said, I will not bow. He drew his line because God had clearly said in a distinct way, thou shalt not. So we continue in this story. And some of the astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of all of those musical instruments must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some of the Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you set up. What would we call these people? Tattletales? Rats? Right? The ones that are out to get you? Here's the thing. When you are a follower of God, this comes with the territory. And it's like very clear in Scripture. You follow me, you're going to have persecution. You follow me, it's going to be a difficult road. And they obeyed. They stood while everybody else kneeled down. And people went and told Nebuchadnezzar. You see, for us, we have to know where black and white are. And how do we know where black and white are? You have to be in the Word. I'm not going to be able to cover all the black and white in a great sermon series saying, and this is what God says to do, and this isn't what God says to do. This is something where we have to recognize that my relationship with God is me and God, and He reveals Himself through His Word. So if I want to know God, I have to read His Word. And sometimes we say, here's me, here's God, and I'm going to put the church in the middle. And if God wants me to hear it, then I'm going to go to church, and He's going to... I want you to know, church has no place between you and God. The church is us together recognizing that we are accountable to God for any and everything in our lives. So they knew their black and white. We must know what God has commanded and what God has not explicitly commanded. But then there are the gray areas as well, right? These areas that the Bible doesn't say, but, right? And how do we deal with these gray area kind of things? Because I look at Mishael. And what's it say here? That he was over the affairs of the province of Babylon. What does that tell you about his education? Was he educated very well in the Babylonian system? Yeah. Was he respected? Yeah. Was he obedient to those who were in authority over him? Yes, he was. But they were unrighteous, unholy, demonic kind of people. But it was a gray area. It's not something that God said, you shall rebel against every pagan king. Did God say that? No. So he had to sit in the situation and say, God, what are you asking me to do in some of these cases and in some of these ways? And he trusted God in that. I want to go to some of these gray areas in the church, in church history. In the 15 and 1600s, there was I'll call it a gray area right now, but it was largely a black and white area for a lot of people in the church. There was a guy named Martin Luther, and he brought something into the church that was completely scandalous and completely unacceptable. A pipe organ. You can't have a pipe organ in the church because a pipe organ is used for things that are outside the church. It is used for things that don't glorify God. How could you use such a terrible, worldly, humanly, demonic instrument and bring it into the church for our music? How could you do such a thing, Martin Luther? Now, as we look at that in the term of perspective, does it say, thou shalt not have a pipe organ in the church? No. And we look at that and say, man, some of us want a pipe organ. Like, oh, I wish it was more old-fashioned like that, right? But the thing is, we look at that and say, how could they miss that? The perspective of like 400 years really changes our eyesight on that, right? Now, who was about 30 or 40 years ago, and there was a drum set on the stage of their church, and it was, again, scandalous. Ironic that I'm the drummer. Anyway, I still laugh at that. Because I remember the church that I grew up in. If you have a drum set in your church, a drum set is used in rock and roll music. And rock and roll music is blessed by witch doctors in somewhere. And somehow when the witch doctors bless our music, it's all satanic. And if we bring a drum set in, somehow that virus of sin is going to infect our church because there's a drum set in our church. And we're all going to get touched by this evil drum beat. Anybody else have those kind of discussions in your church like 30 or 40 years ago? Right? Does it say, thou shalt not have a... So we look at these things, and are there churches that don't have drum sets? Sure. Are they sinful churches? No. Are there churches that do have it? Does it make us any more or less? No. We look at this and say, this is a gray area. This is something that we have to recognize, that when we draw our line, how we draw our line and how we hold to those lines is very important if we are going to be unified as a church. And does God want his church unified? Absolutely. There are things that are black and white. The church cannot call things that are sin, not sin. And it can't say that things are not sin, are sinful. I mean, there is this line, there is the black and white. But then when we get into these gray areas, we have to understand what that looks like. And I want you to know, gratefully for us, there is a biblical example of what that, there was a situation that was happening where these Gentile Roman Christians were coming to know Christ as their Lord and their Savior. And they were just thriving as a church. But some of the Jewish believers were looking at that saying, but they aren't celebrating Jewish holidays. Jesus celebrated Jewish holidays. These guys should celebrate Jewish holidays. And the Jews, they were eating kosher, and these Gentiles, they're not eating kosher food. And this is an issue. And some of these Jewish people are saying they shouldn't have that freedom. And the Romans are like, I'm not Jewish. Why would I quit eating bacon? Anybody else would be with the Romans on that one. I would be. So there was some issues. Because does it say what the laws of the Gentiles should be in the Bible? It doesn't. It says that if you are a Jewish person in this time, in this place, this is what you need to do. But this extended beyond that. So here's what Paul said in Romans chapter 14. Let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. I am convinced, being fully persuaded in the Lord, that nothing is unclean in itself. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for that person, it is unclean. Some people see things and say things like, I can't do that. And should they then be convinced that they could? No. If you have a conviction, hold to your conviction. If you think that something is wrong, then don't do it. But if another person, and this isn't one of these black and white things, but if another person sees it differently, it's okay for them. But hold to the convictions that God has placed in your heart. If your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, then you are no longer acting in love. Do not by eating destroy someone for whom Christ died. Recognize that we have to be conscious of the world around us. Therefore, do not let what you know is good to be spoken of as evil. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. Because anyone who serves Christ in this way is pleasing to God and receives human approval. Therefore, make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. Do not destroy the Lord's work, or the work of God, for the sake of food. All food is clean, but it is wrong for a person to eat something that causes another person to stumble. Many of you have heard this. And I think in a lot of places and a lot of times we get stuck in this mentality that on a non-black and white issue, that we still create black and white decisions. How can they blah, blah, blah? How can those guys blah, blah, blah? And we get to this place where we are not a grace-giving group of people. We have to show grace to one another. And this is on one side. On the other side, we can't become so legalistic that everything that we're uncomfortable with, we throw a Bible verse behind it and say, and this is because I believe that this is what this verse says. We cannot become Christian Pharisees that make everything about rules. And on the flip side, we can't say, well, it doesn't matter what you believe because we all have freedom and I'm just going to do it in front of you and make it uncomfortable. In the gray areas, we have to understand that God has brought different convictions to different people and we have to show grace to one another. Sin is sin, but then there are some things, and I'll throw this out just because it's in front of us all, literally is wearing a mask. Is it sinful to wear a mask? Is there a Bible verse that says, thou shalt not wear a mask? Nope. Do some people have a conviction on that? Yes. Should we try and convince them that how stupid you are to say, oh, you can't wear a mask or you should wear a mask? That is the least grace-giving thing that you can do. For some people, you're convicted. I'm not going to do it. For some people, they're convicted that they need to. Good. Let's show grace and unity to one another in that. Now, I understand that here we have an expectation because we're guests. So we're going to submit to our governing authorities. We're going to do the very best we can. But I want you to know that these are issues that are becoming divisive that shouldn't be. So why did he obey? And to me, the question is, can we show grace? Can I show grace? Looking for the opportunities to show grace for the kingdom of God. So we're going to continue. Daniel 3:16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. It says we were given this position. Good. But we will draw our line on the black and white issues. And I love this because did Mishael have a dream, a vision that night before this happened that God was going to rescue them? No. Did he know for sure that the outcome of the fiery furnace would be that God was glorified through their rescue? Did he know this? No. Did it change his obedience? No. No. So why do we obey? Is it because that somehow God's going to make it good in our eyes? No, I was going to read through a whole bunch of Hebrews, where it says that all these people, they were killed, they were living in caves, they had sheepskins put on them, they were torn to shreds by animals. This isn't just a flannel graph story of an adventure and we look at it. This is a reality that they chose to obey, regardless of what the outcome was going to be. I mean, who gets thrown in a fiery furnace and survives? No one. But for Mishael, I want you to think, but who is what God is? He could rescue us. God may rescue you. He is the only hope. And really, the only outcome is if we live in obedience, we leave the outcome to him regardless of what it is. Regardless of if it's good for me in my eyes or not good for me in my eyes. At the end, if I am obedient, it will end in his glory. And I have to trust him completely in my obedience. So we continue. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And commanded some of his strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent that the furnace was so hot, and the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. If I am Mishael at this point, I obeyed by not bowing, and I still got thrown into the furnace. Don't you wish, like if you're David, and you're like, okay, God, I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to step out onto the battlefield. And as you step out into the battlefield, the miracle that you want to see is that Goliath sees you and he has a heart attack and dies before the battle. Isn't that what you want to see? Isn't that more comfortable? Like, okay, God, okay, we're going to get bound up and thrown into the fiery furnace, and then there's a heating element failure and the thing goes cold and you get thrown in. Right? I mean, isn't that what we want? It's like, I have obedience, and I want immediate response. I want an immediate miracle from God. And sometimes those happen. But usually, we have to obey, and then we have the consequences of obedience. And they're not always good in our eyes. But they trusted. Because who is what God is? You could throw me in the fiery furnace. He's still going to be glorified because there is no other God of who God is. Daniel 3:24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out of there." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses turned into rubble. For no other God can save in this way." God did an absolutely incredible miracle. But one thing I want you to see in this story is that God saved them, but does he save absolutely every person miraculously from every difficulty they go through? The principle of this story is not, well, if you obey, then all of your outcomes are going to be great. The principle of this story is that you obey regardless of how the outcome comes, and God is going to be glorified in the end, however he chooses to be glorified. That's the outcome. Now, the last question that I really wanted to cover today. They defied the king. Did they rebel against the king? Yeah, they did in a way, right? And when I use the word rebel, what I want you to do is put this process in your mind, because I think the struggle that I've had, and you might be able to identify with this. You can kind of give me a little nod if you identify with this. Not big enough that the people around you know, but a little one that you and I can make eye contact. That there is a rebellious spirit that is coming up inside of me saying, I got to do this, and I'm going to put all my Bible verses in front of me so I can get done what I want to get done. Anybody? Yeah. I want to look at Mishael's heart. Did he rebel out of defiance or out of obedience? It was obedience. Did he have a heart of rebellion? He did not. Was it a heart of anger? No. Was he trying to get back at the king, get back at Nebuchadnezzar? And I think you can see this at the end here, because what was his response when God did rescue him? Was it like, "Ha! I told you, my God's better than you. I want to be called Mishael again"? Did he go and flaunt it and have this attitude of I win? No, it was humble. He responded with humility. And I imagine, and I'm putting words here that maybe don't fit, but I'm seeing the heart of Daniel at this time and Mishael and his friends, and I'm seeing the heart of what God calls us to. And in this heart, what I'm seeing is that it broke their heart to rebel. They didn't want to have to rebel, but they had to obey God. And if my obedience to God looks like rebellion in your eyes, my point is not I'm trying to rebel and push you down. My point is I am obeying God in all. It was a heart of wanting to serve Nebuchadnezzar. You see, their lives were defined by respect and honor and submission and obedience to Nebuchadnezzar until the line came to stand and obey God. And they obeyed God, and it broke their heart to rebel, but they stood strong. They didn't rebel in the small things, in the gray areas. They rebelled. They stood for what was right, when it was clear that this is an issue of right and wrong, directly against what God had said. And they rebelled with their hearts pointed to God and to grace to each other. Now, I know you might have been hoping that I would say, and here's where we draw our line, and here's where we take our stand. And I just don't know that we can do that. I think we have to look at each situation and prayerfully consider and look at our convictions and know the Scriptures. And when the Scriptures clearly say, we take our stand in obedience to God, but with a heart of compassion to the world around us, not a heart of rebellion wanting to see them destroyed. God didn't come to see the world destroyed. He came to save the world. And that needs to be our heart when we stand in obedience to God but rebellion to the world, is so that they will see God. What was the outcome here? Was God glorified in their rebellion? No question. And the outcome of our rebellion must always end in the glory of God. And that has to be our heart as we go through and take the stands that we will inevitably take in our lifetime. I want to close with Jeremiah chapter 29. And this is Jeremiah speaking to the exiles in Babylon. And Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet, as you may know. He was the weeping prophet because he saw his people live these lives of rebellion. And he said, God is pulling you, God is drawing you. And they weren't listening. And it broke his heart. I mean, I want you to think, and I often think of Jeremiah in these terms. Was he successful? We would all nod our head and say yes. But if we put him in terms of our modern world, God said, go say what you're going to say, and no one's going to listen to you. So he went and he said, a church, and nobody went to that church, would you say he was successful? Most of us would say no. But the real question is he saying what God asked him to say? And if there's nobody in the room and he's still saying what God asked him to say, then absolutely he's successful. He's doing exactly what he needs to do. That's who Jeremiah was. Jeremiah speaking as a prophet, the words of God, he said, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have the people who killed you, who wiped you out, who drug you out of your promised land, these ruthless people, seek their success. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Then he says, yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. They had people at their time saying things different than that. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams that you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. There were people saying, rebel. Have a heart of rebellion. Don't listen to them. Don't obey. Don't pray for their success. Do everything you can to tear this down because they're pagan. They're bad. They're not of God. And God says, no. Pray for their success. Because if they're successful, you're successful. And this is a hard thing for us to do, I think, because we get so ideological in our world. To humble ourselves, to recognize that God is in control. We have a mission while we are here, and that is to be respectful and honoring to our governing authorities. And last, to know where to draw our lines, to stand for what is true, to stand for what is right. But look for places that we can show grace to the world around. This series. And I hope that these have all been helpful, like reminders. I don't think that they're necessarily things that we are shocked to hear, but they're good reminders. So next week we're going to talk about, so what do we do about this? Like what do we do? What does it look like to be a church in Babylon? What do we do? And I want to put, again, a heart to who God is calling us to be as a church. He's calling us to be that because as we look at his word, that's what he calls his people to be. We're going to close today and close with this. God has called us to live righteous lives. Righteousness is ultimately the result of our maturation, of our growing closer to Him. But it can't be a righteousness that imposes the law and rules on everybody else. It's a righteousness that grows closer to Him, but grows in love to the world around us. The world around us has to see Jesus in us. The heart of Jesus, the eyes of Jesus, and the love of Jesus through us. Jesus said, "You will know who my disciples are by their love for one another." That's the definition of the church. We're like, but they're doing wrong things. We have to speak the things wrong. The Holy Spirit convicts things of wrong. God is the judge. We are called to play our part, and that is to love a lost and dying world. That's what Daniel did. That's what Mishael did. That's what his friends did. And we can make an influence in this world. We can make an impact. We can make a ripple. But we have to do it God's way, because if we do it the world's way, we will certainly lose. So I'm going to close in prayer. If you'd bow your head and close your eyes. It's going to be a little bit of prayer. So as I give you something, there will be a moment of silence where you can respond to God in your heart. And it's my prayer that God has spoken to your heart. And if God is speaking to your heart, you respond to God in the same way. So if God is speaking to your heart, if He's convicting you of sin, if He is challenging you in some way to start doing something or stop doing something, or even in relationship to the circumstance that we currently face in this world, I want you to take a moment and respond to Him, because He's speaking to you.